Picture a wedding invitation, not for cousins, not for a family friend arranged into the fold. For a brother and a sister raised in the same nursery, nursed by the same women, taught to walk the same palace floors before either of them could speak in full sentences. In ancient Egypt, this was not scandal. It was policy written, sanctioned, and performed in front of an entire priesthood. Between 1550 BCE and 30 BCE, spanning the New Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, brother-sister marriage among Egyptian royalty happened often enough to be unremarkable inside the palace walls. Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt, married two of her own brothers across her lifetime first, Ptolemy XIII, then later Ptolemy XIV. She was around 18 when the first marriage occurred, in 51 BCE, the same year her father, Ptolemy XII, died, and left her a throne she would have to share with a boy she'd grown up beside. Here is the fact that breaks the assumption. This wasn't hidden, denied, or whispered about in back corridors. It was carved into temple walls at sites like Karnak and Edfu. It was announced to the public in official inscriptions, listed alongside military victories and flood levels of the Nile. In a civilization that mummified organs into labeled jars, tracked star positions with enough precision to align pyramids to true north, and kept tax records on individual farming plots. This practice was treated not as a taboo to manage, but as a truth to display proof, not confession. What you're about to learn isn't really a story about incest. It's a story about what a civilization will do to convince an entire population that its rulers are not fully human, and what that decision cost. Generation after generation, quietly written into bone long before anyone had the tools to read it. Start with the myth the Egyptians told themselves, because the marriages didn't come first. The story did, and it had to come first, because without it, the practice would have had no cover at all. In Egyptian religious tradition, the gods Osiris and Isis were siblings born of the same parents, the sky goddess Nut and the earth god Geb. They were also husband and wife. Their union produced Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship, the deity every reigning pharaoh claimed to embody in life and become fully in death. This wasn't a minor footnote buried in scripture read only by priests. It was the load-bearing wall of the entire Egyptian theory of kingship. If the pharaoh was Horus on earth, and Horus himself was born from a sibling marriage between gods, then a sibling marriage among royalty wasn't a deviation from the natural order. It was a direct reenactment of the order the gods themselves had already established. By marrying his sister, a pharaoh wasn't imitating ordinary human family structures at all. He was stepping outside them entirely, offering living proof. Every farmer, scribe, and soldier kneeling below him that his bloodline answered to a different set of rules than theirs ever could. But here's where it gets stranger. The myth gave sibling marriage its justification. But myths don't run an empire on their own. Numbers do. And the numbers behind this particular practice tell a harder, more physical story than religion alone can explain. Start with Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt from roughly 1353 to 1336 BCE. He's most widely remembered for a religious revolution abandoning Egypt's entire traditional pantheon of gods to worship a single sun disk, the Aten, and relocating the capital to a new city called Akhetaten, built from nothing in the desert. Less famous and far more consequential to this story, genetic testing published in 2010 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, led by Egyptian archaeologist and geneticist Zahi Hawass, alongside a team running DNA analysis on 11 royal mummies, suggested that Akhenaten's own parents, Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, were full siblings. The mummy widely believed, based on genetic markers, to be Tutankhamun, and found evidence consistent with a union between Akhenaten and one of his own sisters, Tutankhamun, the boy king whose golden burial mask has since toured museums on nearly every continent and become perhaps the single most recognized artifact in human history, was very possibly the product of 2 consecutive generations of sibling pairing, and his body carried the weight of that history. Tutankhamun's skeleton, examined through CT scans conducted in 2005 and expanded through further imaging and DNA work in the years after, showed a club foot, along with bone necrosis in his left foot, severe enough to require walking support. 130 canes and walking sticks were found buried with him in his tomb, many showing visible wear consistent with actual use rather than ceremonial placement. He also had a cleft palate and a curved spine. Malaria DNA was found in his tissue on more than one occasion, evidence that he suffered from repeated infections his body may have struggled to fight off effectively. He died around age 19 in approximately 1323 BCE, The exact cause of death is still debated among researchers. A broken leg, an infection, a combination of chronic conditions compounding each other, but his physical frailty across those 19 years is not in dispute. Modern genetics has a name for what likely happened across these generations: inbreeding depression. When close relatives reproduce repeatedly across successive generations, harmful recessive traits, the kind normally diluted into rarity by genetic diversity from unrelated partners, begin stacking on top of each other instead of canceling out. Immune deficiencies, skeletal malformations, higher rates of infant and childhood mortality. Researchers have noted that of the known children of Tutankhamun and his wife Ankhesenamun, herself likely his half-sister, 2 mummified fetuses were found buried with him, both stillborn or dying shortly after birth. The Egyptian royal line wasn't immune to biology just because it believed itself divine. It was, in hindsight, one of history's clearest demonstrations of biology enforcing itself anyway. That's not the whole story, though, because if the cost was this visible, this consistent, this literally written into bone and buried alongside the bodies for archaeologists to find 3,000 years later, the obvious question becomes why the practice didn't stop, why dynasty after dynasty, generation after generation, kept choosing it anyway, apparently with open eyes. Except there was a problem far bigger than biology to them. And it had nothing to do with love, or even, really, with the gods. The problem was power specifically. Who got to keep it, and who got to be certain it would stay exactly where it already was? In ancient Egypt, royal legitimacy didn't pass through the pharaoh alone. It passed just as heavily through the pharaoh's principal wife, often carrying the title God's Wife of Amun, or Great Royal Wife, a position with its own religious authority, its own land holdings, and its own priesthood in later periods. Marrying outside the family meant marrying that authority into someone else's bloodline entirely. A foreign princess brought a foreign court's interests into the palace. A noble's daughter brought her father's ambitions. Even a vizier's sister could quietly hand her relatives a legitimate stake in the line of succession, one marriage away from the throne itself. Keeping marriage inside the royal family closed that door completely. A sister could not build a rival power base from outside the palace because she had none to build her interests. And the throne's interests were, in theory, already identical, inherited from the same parents. Historians studying succession patterns across the 18th and 19th dynasty, roughly 1550 to 1186 BCE, have noted that sibling and half-sibling marriage clustered most heavily precisely among reigning pharaohs and their immediate heirs, not among the wider Egyptian nobility, who largely didn't practice it at all, and not among ordinary Egyptians, who married outside their families, much like other ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern societies archaeologists have studied. This wasn't a culture-wide custom quietly tolerated. It was a narrow, deliberate political tool, reserved for perhaps a dozen people at any given time, the ones closest to the throne, where the stakes of a fractured claim were considered too dangerous to risk. That distinction matters more than it might first seem. A civilization-wide belief that sibling marriage was simply normal would be one kind of story. A royal court making a calculated, repeated exception, fully aware of what common practice looked like everywhere else in Egyptian society, is a different story entirely. It suggests the decision wasn't ignorance, it was arithmetic. The court weighed a biological cost most families would never accept against a political cost they considered far worse: a splintered claim to divine kingship, a rival bloodline with a legitimate case for the crown, a dynasty diluted by outside interests within a generation or two. Ptolemaic Egypt, centuries later, shows the same math still running. Cleopatra VII wasn't inventing a new custom when she married her brothers. She was inheriting a script written more than 1,000 years earlier, one that had already survived the New Kingdom, already survived Akhenaten's religious upheaval, already survived the birth of a frail boy king buried at 19 with 130 canes at his side. The script worked, politically, even as it visibly failed, biologically, generation after generation. So, the pharaohs didn't marry their sisters because they misunderstood the risk in front of them. The physical evidence, the club feet, the cleft palates, the stillborn infants buried in miniature coffins, suggests they saw at least some of it, or lived close enough to it that it couldn't have gone entirely unnoticed. Evidence suggests instead that they simply ranked that risk below a different one: the risk of losing the single claim that made a pharaoh in the eyes of everyone kneeling before him. Not his army, not his wealth. His blood, the idea that it was not like other blood at all, and never could be, which leaves a strange thought to sit with. Every rule you follow to protect what your family holds, a name, a business, a title, a house passed down for generations, is some version of the same trade the Egyptians made 3,000 years ago. Something is always given up to keep power exactly where it already is. Most families never have to name what that something is. The Egyptians did. They carved it into stone in temples anyone could walk into, for anyone standing there to read.